He paid $7 for a dying farmhouse. Then his war dog uncovered a secret powerful men would kill to keep buried. Snow hammered the windshield of a rusted Chevy Suburban parked outside a Montana truck stop. Inside, former Navy SEAL Caleb Mercer slept in short, broken bursts, haunted by missions that never made the news. Beside him, his scarred Belgian Malinois, Ghost, kept watch. When a condemned farmhouse deep in the mountains goes up for auction for $1, Caleb makes a desperate bid, never knowing the land hides something that was never meant to be found. Would you have taken the risk? Comment 1 if you'd stand your ground, or 0 if you'd walk away. And tell us where you're watching from. The wind hit the side of the Suburban like a slow-moving freight train. Caleb Mercer's eyes snapped open before he even understood why. His hand shot instinctively toward the knife tucked beside the driver's seat, heart hammering, breath shallow. For a split second, he wasn't in Montana. He was back in Syria, sand in his teeth, gunfire cracking across rooftops, smoke choking the sky. Then the world came back into focus. Snow, darkness, the interior roof of a rusted 2004 Chevy Suburban. The storm outside howled across the open stretch of asphalt behind the Flying J truck stop just outside Bozeman. Neon lights flickered through the frosted windshield, bleeding red and blue streaks into the cramped cabin. The heater had died hours ago. The air inside the vehicle was so cold that every breath turned white before fading into nothing. Caleb lay twisted across the folded back seats, a threadbare army blanket pulled over his chest. His beard had grown thick and uneven, streaked with early gray. Frost crept along the inside of the windows like veins spreading across glass. Beside him, pressed against his ribs for warmth, was Ghost. The Belgian Malinois lifted his head slowly, amber eyes alert but calm. One ear twitched at the wind. A jagged scar cut through the fur above his right shoulder, shrapnel from a blast that had taken half of Caleb's team years ago. His left hind leg never fully healed. On cold nights like this, it stiffened. "You're good," Caleb whispered, voice rough from sleep and old nightmares. "Just the wind." Ghost studied him for a moment longer, then lowered his head back against Caleb's chest. The dog's body heat was the only real warmth in the truck. Caleb closed his eyes again, but the dream wouldn't let him go. He saw it clearly. The rooftop in Raqqa, the flash of an RPG, the radio screaming with broken voices. He remembered pulling Mason's body across shattered concrete while bullets punched into the wall inches from his face. He remembered the silence after the smoke cleared. 4 men, gone. And the official report later calling it a tactical miscalculation. His jaw tightened. Misconduct paperwork had followed. Quiet meetings. A demand to sign a statement shifting responsibility. Caleb refused. He didn't lose his rank that day, but he lost everything else slowly after. His marriage cracked first, then the house, then the job offers dried up. Then the VA appointments stopped returning his calls. The wind slammed into the Suburban again, rocking the frame hard enough to make Ghost lift his head. Caleb forced himself upright and rubbed his hands together, trying to wake circulation back into his fingers. The digital clock on the dash blinked 4:12 a.m. He reached into a plastic grocery bag tucked between the seats and pulled out a single dented can of dog food. He stared at it for a long moment. That was it. No more in reserve. No emergency stash. Ghost watched him quietly. Caleb grabbed the small folding knife, punctured the lid, and peeled it back. The metallic scent filled the cold air. He emptied the can into a plastic bowl and set it down on the floorboard. "Eat," he said. Ghost hesitated, just slightly, then lowered his head and began to eat. Caleb turned away, pretending to search for something in the glove compartment. His stomach cramped. He hadn't eaten since noon the day before. There were 2 protein bars left in the center console. He pushed the thought aside. Ghost finished quickly and licked the bowl clean. Caleb reached down and scratched behind his ears. Good boy. Outside, a pickup truck roared into the parking lot, tires spinning in slush. Voices followed. Young, loud, reckless. Caleb's shoulders stiffened. 3 teenage boys stumbled from the truck, laughing, boots crunching through snow. One of them spotted the Suburban. Hey, the tallest one called out. You see that thing? Looks abandoned. Another laughed. Probably some drifter living in it. Caleb remained still. He'd learned invisibility over the past year. If you didn't move, didn't react, didn't make eye contact, most people lost interest. A snowball hit the rear window with a dull thud. Ghost's head rose instantly. A low vibration rolled through his chest. Easy, Caleb murmured. Another snowball, harder this time. Bet there's someone in there, one of the boys said. Hey, you alive in there? A flashlight beam cut through the tinted glass, blinding Caleb for a moment. Instinct screamed at him to move, to engage, to step out and control the situation. Old training flickered in his muscles. But this wasn't a battlefield. It was a truck stop. Ghost stood slowly, placing himself between Caleb and the window. The growl that followed wasn't loud, but it was deep, controlled, the kind of sound that came from something that didn't bluff. The boys went quiet. Dude, that's a big dog. Another beat of silence, then nervous laughter. Forget it. Let's go. Boots retreated through the snow. The pickup engine roared again and disappeared onto the highway. Caleb didn't move for another full minute. Then he exhaled. Good watch, he whispered. Ghost eased back down, but his eyes stayed on the window until the parking lot fell silent again. The storm continued to rage. Snow drifted sideways under the yellow lights. Tractor trailers idled in long rows, engines humming like distant thunder. Caleb leaned his forehead against the steering wheel. This wasn't living. It was waiting. Waiting for warmer weather. Waiting for a call that would never come. Waiting for a system that had already decided he was inconvenient. He reached into the center console and pulled out one of the protein bars. He broke it in half and held the larger piece toward Ghost. The dog didn't take it. Caleb smirked faintly. Stubborn. He set the larger piece down anyway and forced himself to chew the smaller half. It tasted like chalk and regret. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside the rusted Suburban, beneath layers of silence and wind, a decorated Navy SEAL and a wounded war dog lay side by side. 2 survivors the world had quietly stepped around, and neither of them knew that in less than 48 hours, a $7 farmhouse buried deep in the Montana mountains would change everything. Morning came gray and brittle. The storm had burned itself out before dawn, leaving the world buried in fresh snow that glowed pale under a hard winter sun. The truck stop parking lot looked almost peaceful now, as if the wind hadn't tried to rip the Suburban apart just hours earlier. Caleb stepped out of the vehicle slowly, boots crunching into several inches of powder. The cold hit like a hammer. Ghost followed, favoring his back leg slightly, but keeping close to Caleb's side. The dog's breath rose in steady white clouds. Caleb stretched, every joint stiff. He scanned the lot automatically. Entries, exits, blind corners. Old habits didn't fade. They just went quiet until needed. Inside the truck stop, heat blasted against his face. The smell of coffee and diesel fuel hung thick in the air. Truckers sat at small tables, hands wrapped around mugs, voices low and tired. No one looked at him twice. That was the strange comfort of places like this. Everyone carried something heavy. Caleb filled a paper cup with water and slipped it into his coat pocket for Ghost. He avoided the breakfast counter. The menu board glowed with photos of eggs and bacon he couldn't afford. Outside again, he poured the water into Ghost's bowl beside the Suburban. The dog drank patiently. "You hang tight," Caleb murmured. "I'll be back." A mile down the road, past a frozen drainage ditch and a line of bare cottonwoods, stood a squat brick building with a faded sign. Gallatin County Public Library, Silver Ridge Branch. The doors opened at 9. Caleb waited outside until they did. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and carpet cleaner. The heating vents rattled softly. Only 2 other people sat near the computers. An older woman reading a newspaper and a college-aged kid typing with headphones on. Caleb chose the corner terminal, back to the wall. Ghost lay at his feet, head on his paws, watching the room without moving. Caleb's reflection stared back at him from the dark computer screen before it came to life. The man in the glass looked older than 38. Lines cut deep around his eyes. The haunted look and never fully left. He logged into the public access browser and typed slowly. Veterans assistance, temporary housing, work programs. The same results appeared. Waiting lists, closed applications, requirements he couldn't meet without a permanent address. His jaw tightened. He minimized the page and opened a new tab. For no clear reason, he searched county auctions. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the quiet hum of the library. Or maybe it was the small, stubborn part of him that refused to stop looking for a door that hadn't been nailed shut yet. A PDF link caught his eye. Gallatin County Foreclosure and Seized Property Auction. Winter listing. He clicked. The document loaded slowly, each page appearing in blocks of black text and legal disclaimers. Most properties carried starting bids in the thousands. Cabins near ski slopes, empty parcels outside town, storage units full of abandoned junk. He scrolled without interest. Then he saw it. Lot 22, Black Hollow Farm, location, mountain boundary near Idaho line. Acreage, 3.4 acres. Structure, residential farmhouse. Condemned. Condition, severe disrepair. Partial structural collapse. Minimum bid, $1. Caleb leaned closer to the screen. The description included a single black and white photograph. The image showed a 2-story farmhouse sitting alone in a wide clearing. Pine trees ringed the property like silent sentries. Snow covered the roof. The porch sagged slightly. One upper window was boarded shut. It didn't look haunted. It looked forgotten. He clicked the details page. Notes listed previous tax liens, abandonment since the late 1970s, and multiple failed auction attempts over the past decade. No utilities. No warranties. Sold as is. In a small sidebar, someone had left a public comment from months earlier. Stay away. People disappeared near there back in the Cold War. Place ain't right. Caleb sat back. He didn't believe in haunted farms, but he believed in isolation. 3 acres in the mountains meant space, privacy, a roof, 4 walls between Ghost and the snow. He checked the date. Auction, tomorrow. 10 a.m. Silver Ridge Community Center. He opened his wallet. $7 and some loose change. Gas tank, just above empty. He exhaled slowly. "This is stupid," he muttered under his breath. Ghost's ears flicked. Caleb stared at the photograph again. He imagined the Suburban parked beside that farmhouse instead of behind a truck stop. He imagined snow falling outside while they slept under a roof that didn't shake with every gust. It wasn't hope. It was calculation. A condemned house still blocked wind. A broken door still closed. He shut down the computer. As he stood, the older woman at the newspaper glanced at him and then at Ghost. "He's beautiful," she said softly. Caleb hesitated, unused to conversation. "Yes, ma'am." "Military dog?" "Yes, ma'am." She nodded as if that explained everything. Outside, the sky had cleared completely. Sunlight reflected off the snow so brightly it hurt his eyes. Ghost walked beside him, steady and loyal. Back at the Suburban, Caleb opened the rear hatch and checked the emergency gas can. Empty. He calculated distance in his head. Black Hollow Farm was roughly 60 miles from Silver Ridge. Mountain roads, icy conditions, risk versus reward. He rested his hand on Ghost's neck. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. Ghost leaned into him. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. He remembered signing his separation papers, remembered the look on the commanding officer's face, half pity, half relief. He remembered driving away from base housing for the last time, the American flag snapping above the gate behind him. He had stopped existing that day in the eyes of the system, but he wasn't dead. Not yet. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine coughed once, then twice before finally catching. "All right," he said softly. "One last gamble." Snow crunched beneath the tires as the Suburban pulled onto the road. In the rearview mirror, the truck stop grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind a curve of white hills. Ahead, the mountains waited, and somewhere beyond them, a condemned farmhouse no one else wanted. The air inside the Suburban felt different now. Not warmer, not safer, but sharper. Ghost lifted his head, watching the road ahead. Caleb gripped the steering wheel tighter. Tomorrow, he would walk into a room full of men with money and power. Tomorrow, he would raise his hand with $7 to his name. And if he lost... He pushed the thought away. The snow glittered under the sun. For the first time in months, Caleb wasn't just surviving the next hour. He was moving towards something. The highway cut through the Montana landscape like a dark ribbon laid across white silk. Snow-covered fields stretched wide on both sides, broken only by fence posts leaning under the weight of winter and distant barns standing silent against the mountains. Inside the Suburban, the engine hummed unevenly. Every few miles, Caleb glanced at the temperature gauge, half expecting the needle to spike. The heater pushed out a weak stream of lukewarm air, barely enough to keep the windshield clear. Ghost sat upright in the passenger seat now, ears alert, eyes scanning the road ahead as if they were still on patrol. Silver Ridge came into view around mid-morning, a small mining town tucked between rising hills, its main street lined with brick storefronts and old wooden awnings. A faded mural of a gold miner covered the side of a hardware store. The community center sat near the end of the street, a low building with a metal roof half buried in snow. Caleb parked 2 blocks away, choosing a spot near an alley instead of the main entrance. He shut off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked like what he was, tired, unshaven, wearing a heavy jacket that had seen better years. "Stay," he told Ghost softly. The dog's eyes held his. "Just for a bit." Ghost settled back into the seat, but did not look away. Caleb stepped out into the cold. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked toward the community center. A few pickup trucks and SUVs were already parked outside, some of them new enough to gleam even under winter dust. Inside, the air smelled of old coffee and melting snow from damp boots. Folding chairs had been arranged in rows facing a long table at the front of the room. About 30 people filled the seats, ranchers in thick coats, men in pressed jackets, a few women holding folders and tablets. Caleb took a seat in the back. He felt eyes flicker toward him and then away. He didn't blame them. He knew how he looked sitting there alone, hands empty, boots worn down at the heels. At the front of the room, a county clerk adjusted a microphone and shuffled papers. "All right, folks," the clerk began, voice echoing slightly. "We'll begin with commercial properties and work our way down the list. All sales final. Cash or certified check at close." The auction started briskly. A storage unit near Bozeman sparked a short bidding war. A small lake cabin went for far more than Caleb expected. Numbers climbed fast. 5,000, 10,000, 20. He sat still, heart steady, waiting. Finally, after nearly an hour, the clerk cleared his throat. "Next, Lot 22, Black Hollow Farm, 3.4 acres, condemned residential structure, sold as is." A murmur passed through the room. Caleb felt it shift, subtle, uneasy. A tall man in a tailored coat leaned back in his chair 2 rows ahead. His hair was silver at the temples, his posture relaxed but sharp. Caleb recognized him from the local paper headlines posted at the truck stop. Victor Hale, the developer expanding the luxury ski resort on the East Ridge. Hale chuckled lightly. "Black Hollow," he said to the man beside him. "That's a money pit if I've ever seen one." The clerk adjusted his glasses. "Minimum bid $1. Silence. Someone near the front laughed under their breath. "You'd have to pay me to take it," a rancher muttered. Caleb's pulse ticked once. He raised his hand. $1. Heads turned. The clerk blinked. "I have $1. A few people shifted in their seats. The rancher who had spoken earlier scratched his beard thoughtfully. "5, he called out casually. Caleb felt the air tighten. $5. He slid his hand into his coat pocket and pressed his fingers against the folded bills inside. $7. That was everything. Gas, food, margin of survival. The rancher glanced back toward him, studying him now more carefully. Caleb's mind calculated again. If he lost this, nothing changed. He would return to the Suburban, to the truck stop, to another night of wind and frost. But if he won... He lifted his hand again. 7. The word came out steady. A quiet ripple passed through the room. It wasn't just the amount. It was the finality of it. The rancher looked at Caleb for a long moment. Then his gaze drifted toward the window, where the Suburban was visible down the street. Ghost's silhouette could be seen through the windshield, unmoving. The rancher's expression softened just slightly. He leaned back in his chair and shook his head. The clerk tapped the microphone. $7 going once, going twice. Victor Hale watched silently, eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Sold. Lot 22 to the gentleman in the back for $7. The gavel struck. The sound echoed louder in Caleb's chest than in the room. For a moment, he didn't move. $7. He had just bought a farmhouse. He stood, walked to the front table, and placed the crumpled bills into the clerk's hand. The clerk gave him a long look, half confusion, half curiosity, but said nothing. Papers were signed. Liability waivers initialed. A stamped document slid across the table toward him. Black Hollow Farm was his. As he stepped outside into the winter light, the cold air felt different. Not softer, but sharper, cleaner. Victor Hale exited the building moments later, Pulling on leather gloves, he paused near Caleb. "Interesting purchase," Hale said smoothly. Caleb met his eyes but did not answer. Hale smiled faintly. "You know that land borders my development project." Caleb said nothing. "It's a dangerous property," Hale added. "Some places are better left alone." Their eyes held for a brief second longer. Then Hale walked toward a black SUV parked at the curb. Caleb watched him leave, unease stirring beneath the small pulse of victory in his chest. He returned to the Suburban and opened the driver's door. Ghost rose immediately, tail low but alert. Caleb held up the stamped document. "We got it," he said quietly. Ghost tilted his head. Caleb allowed himself the smallest smile he'd felt in months. $7, he murmured. But as he turned the key and the engine rumbled to life, he glanced once more at the black SUV pulling onto the road ahead. Victor Hale had looked too interested, too alert. The mountains waited beyond town, white peaks cutting into a bright winter sky. Caleb eased the Suburban forward, steering toward the road that would lead them to Black Hollow Farm. Behind him, Silver Ridge shrank into the valley. Ahead, something unknown and possibly dangerous waited in the trees. The paved road ended 15 miles outside Silver Ridge. From there, Caleb followed a narrow county route that twisted upward into the mountains. Snowbanks rose high along both sides, turning the road into a white corridor between dark pine forests. The Suburban's tires crunched over packed ice, occasionally slipping before catching again. Ghost leaned forward in his seat, nose close to the windshield. Caleb drove with steady hands, eyes scanning ridgelines and blind curves. The higher they climbed, the quieter the world became. No passing cars, no distant farmhouses, just trees and sky and the faint hum of the engine. A wooden sign appeared at a fork in the road, half buried in snow. Black Hollow. 2 miles. The arrow pointed down an even narrower path barely visible beneath drifts. Caleb slowed. "You sure about this?" he muttered to himself. Ghost's ears twitched. He turned the wheel. The Suburban struggled through deep snow, tires throwing powder against the undercarriage. The path curved sharply once, then again, before opening into a clearing. Caleb eased off the gas. Black Hollow Farm stood in the center of it. The farmhouse was larger than it had looked in the auction photo. 2 stories of faded white siding peeled back to bare wood in places. The roof sagged slightly near the back corner. The porch leaned a few inches to the right, its railing half collapsed under the weight of snow. An old red barn sat behind it, blackened on one side as if fire had licked at the boards years ago. The fields around the house were open but wild, fence lines broken and swallowed by drifts. For a long moment, Caleb didn't move. The clearing was too quiet. No birds, no wind through the trees. Just silence thick enough to feel. He shut off the engine. The sudden stillness rang in his ears. Ghost gave a low sound in his throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine. Caleb reached for the door handle. Cold air hit hard as he stepped out. His boots sank deep. Snow reached nearly to his calves as he circled the Suburban slowly, scanning the tree line. The property felt abandoned, but not empty. Ghost jumped down from the passenger side, landing lightly despite his injured leg. He moved ahead of Caleb, nose low, sweeping the ground. Caleb approached the porch carefully. The wooden boards creaked under his weight, but held. He tested the front door. It was locked, but the frame was warped. The wood split near the latch. He stepped back and studied the siding. That's when he noticed the first detail that didn't belong. A metal pole, half rusted, rose from the snow about 20 yards from the house. At first glance, it looked like part of an old fence post, but it wasn't wood. It was steel, and near the top was a small, circular bracket where something had once been mounted. A camera mount. Caleb turned slowly. Near the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a pine tree, stood another identical pole. His pulse ticked upward. Old surveillance equipment. His gaze shifted back to the farmhouse. Ghost had stopped near the front steps. The dog's body was stiff now, tail low, ears forward. "What is it?" Caleb murmured. Ghost moved past the front door and around the side of the house, limping slightly but persistent. Caleb followed. Along the back wall, half buried in snow, something dark cut across the ground. Caleb knelt and brushed away powder with his glove. Cable. Thick, insulated cable running from beneath the house toward the tree line. He stood slowly. This wasn't just a forgotten farm. This place had been wired. He circled the house once more, eyes tracing the siding, the window frames. One upstairs window was boarded from the inside. Another showed signs of recent disturbance, small scratches in the paint around the frame. Recent. Caleb's breath slowed. He stepped back onto the porch and pushed against the door harder this time. The frame groaned and split open with a sharp crack. The smell inside hit immediately. Dust, rot, and old wood long exposed to winter air. He entered carefully, boots crunching over debris. The living room ceiling sagged in one corner, where moisture had weakened the beams. A faded couch sat against the far wall, stuffing spilling out like white weeds. The kitchen lay beyond an archway, cabinets hanging crooked from their hinges. Ghost moved ahead of him, nose working constantly. Caleb checked each room methodically, clearing corners, scanning for movement. The house was empty, but not untouched. Near the back door, he found something that tightened his chest. Fresh tire tracks. Outside the rear entrance, the snow had been disturbed recently. The prints were narrow, modern tread, too clean to belong to his Suburban. He crouched, running a gloved finger along the indentation. Within the last 24 hours. Ghost's head snapped toward the kitchen suddenly. The dog walked stiffly toward the center of the room, nose hovering inches above the floorboards. He circled once, twice. Then he stopped directly over a patch of warped wood near an old cast-iron stove bolted to the floor. His body went rigid. A low growl vibrated through the quiet house. Caleb stepped closer. The floorboards beneath Ghost's paws were darker than the surrounding wood. The nails looked newer. Caleb crouched and pressed his hand flat against the boards. Cold. Solid. But beneath it, just faintly, he thought he felt a hollow echo. Ghost looked up at him. The same look he'd given years ago in Syria before finding a buried explosive beneath rubble. Caleb's throat tightened. "Easy," he whispered. The light outside began to fade as afternoon slipped toward evening. Long shadows stretched across the clearing. Snow reflected the last orange streaks of sun. Caleb stood slowly and stepped back from the floor. They would not open anything tonight. Not in fading light. Not without preparation. He closed the front door as best he could and returned to the Suburban to retrieve his small toolbox and flashlight. As he walked back toward the house, he glanced once more toward the tree line. For just a second, so quick he almost convinced himself it was nothing. He thought he saw movement between the pines. A dark shape shifting out of view. His pulse climbed again. Ghost's growl deepened. The mountains were quiet. But Black Hollow Farm was not abandoned, and whatever had once been hidden here was still drawing attention. Dusk settled over Black Hollow Farm like a heavy curtain. The last light drained from the mountains, leaving the clearing washed in blue shadow. Snow along the porch rail caught the fading glow before sinking into gray. Caleb stood just inside the front doorway, flashlight in hand, listening. Nothing. No engines. No voices. No footsteps in snow. But the feeling of being watched lingered, tight and persistent at the base of his neck. He closed the door as best he could and dragged an old wooden chair against it for support. The house groaned softly as the temperature dropped. Wind slipped through cracks in the siding, carrying the faint scent of pine and frozen earth. Ghost paced once around the living room, then returned to the kitchen, stopping again at the same warped section of floor near the cast-iron stove. Caleb set down his toolbox on the counter, its surface coated in dust. He knelt beside the dog. "You're sure?" he murmured. Ghost didn't bark. He didn't scratch wildly. He simply placed one paw gently on the darker plank and stared at Caleb with steady focus. It was the same look he'd given before detecting hidden explosives overseas. No panic, no aggression, just certainty. Caleb swallowed. The rational part of his mind tried to explain it away. Old foundations shift. Animals burrow beneath abandoned houses. Floorboards warp in cold weather. But the cable outside, the surveillance poles, the fresh tire tracks, none of that was normal. He pried at the edge of the board with the flat end of a crowbar from the toolbox. The wood resisted at first, then gave with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty house. Dust rose in a gray cloud. Ghost stepped back, nose working furiously. Caleb pulled up one plank, then another. Beneath them lay packed dirt, and something else. Concrete. Not farmhouse foundation concrete. This was poured smooth, reinforced with steel mesh. He leaned closer, sweeping the flashlight beam across the surface. There. A faint seam cut through the slab. Rectangular. Deliberate. Caleb's breath slowed. He brushed dirt away carefully until a small steel ring emerged, flush with the concrete. His heart began to pound, not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't random. This was engineered. He wedged the crowbar beneath the steel ring and pulled. Nothing. He repositioned, using more leverage, muscles straining. The steel shifted slightly with a deep metallic groan. Ghost stepped closer, body tense but silent. Caleb adjusted his grip and pulled harder. The concrete rectangle lifted an inch. Beneath it, darkness opened like a mouth. Cold air rose from below, air that felt different from the winter wind. Older. Stale. He froze. This was the moment where common sense demanded retreat. He could cover it back up. Leave. Drive away before dark. But he didn't. Slowly, he lifted the slab higher until it tipped onto its side with a heavy thud. A steel ladder descended into blackness. The beam of his flashlight cut downward, revealing concrete walls extending far below the farmhouse. Ghost let out a low, uneasy rumble. Caleb's pulse drummed in his ears. "All right," he whispered. He grabbed a heavier flashlight from his bag and strapped it to his wrist. He drew his pocket knife, not for combat, but habit. Then he stepped onto the ladder. Each rung creaked under his weight. The smell intensified as he descended. Dust, metal, something faintly chemical. 10 feet down. 15. The beam of light reached a concrete floor. Caleb stepped off the ladder and turned slowly. He stood in a bunker. The ceiling was reinforced with thick steel beams. Electrical conduit ran along the walls. An old control panel with cracked dials sat mounted near the entrance. Metal shelves lined the far wall, and they were not empty. Wooden crates stamped with faded military markings sat stacked 3 high. Ghost descended carefully behind him, landing lightly despite the tight space. His posture was alert, ears upright. Caleb moved closer to the nearest crate. The stencil read, U.S. Property, 1974, do not tamper. His throat tightened. He pried open the crate lid. Inside lay sealed radio equipment, vacuum-packed and preserved. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, were thick folders stamped Classified. Caleb opened one. Photographs spilled into his hands. Black and white images of rural landscapes, this very clearing decades earlier. Trucks parked near the farmhouse, men in uniforms without insignia. A group of civilians standing beside a fence, faces blurred. He flipped to another page. Typed reports, coded references, mentions of Project Hollow Ridge. His breathing slowed dangerously. Ghost moved toward a collapsed shelf in the corner. He sniffed once, then pawed gently at debris. Caleb walked over and knelt. Under a rusted metal tray, half buried in dust, lay a set of military dog tags. He lifted them carefully. The name engraved on the metal read, Lieutenant Daniel Rowe, U.S. Marine Corps status, MIA, 1975. Caleb stared at the tag. Missing in action. Officially lost. But here was proof he had been here. In this bunker. Beneath this farmhouse. His stomach twisted. This wasn't forgotten storage. This was something buried on purpose. A sudden metallic creak echoed faintly from above. Caleb froze. Ghost's head snapped toward the ladder. They both listened. Silence. But not natural silence. The kind that follows movement. Caleb switched off his flashlight instantly. Darkness swallowed them. He motioned for Ghost to stay. Footsteps. Very faint. Above them. Snow crunching. Caleb's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. Someone was outside the farmhouse, and whoever it was hadn't expected the hatch to be open. Caleb stood in absolute darkness, one hand resting lightly on Ghost's collar to steady him. The bunker air felt heavier now, thick with dust and the weight of something long buried. Above them, the footsteps moved slowly across the kitchen floor. Not rushed, not panicked, measured. Caleb's pulse slowed instead of racing. Training took over. He mapped the house in his mind. The broken front door, the sagging back entrance, the windows he had checked earlier. The footsteps paused directly above the hatch. Silence pressed in. Ghost's muscles tightened beneath Caleb's hand, but he did not bark. His breathing remained controlled. A faint scraping sound followed. The steel slab. Someone nudged it. The opening must have been visible. Caleb's jaw clenched. He reached up and quietly pressed the hatch from below, lowering it inch by inch until the concrete lid met the floor again. The last half-inch slid into place with a muted scrape. Darkness returned to complete silence. The footsteps stopped. Another long pause. Then a voice, muffled but clear enough. Looks like someone's been inside. Male. Mid-30s maybe. Calm. Another voice answered from farther away. You sure? Floor's disturbed. Caleb held his breath. Snow crunched outside the house again. The footsteps moved away slowly toward the porch. A vehicle door shut. Engine started. Faded. Caleb remained still for a full 60 seconds after the sound disappeared. Only then did he switch the flashlight back on. Ghost looked up at him, eyes bright and steady. They came quick, Caleb murmured. Less than an hour since he'd opened the hatch. That meant surveillance, monitoring, Someone had been watching the property long before he arrived. Caleb climbed the ladder carefully and pushed the hatch open a crack. The kitchen above was dim but empty. The snow outside the back door showed fresh tracks leading toward the tree line. Boot prints, 2 sets, professional tread, not local ranchers. He stepped fully into the kitchen and crouched near the doorframe. The tracks didn't circle the house randomly. They had moved directly to the back door, then around toward the side wall, then back toward the woods. They knew exactly where to look. Ghost sniffed the air intensely, hackles slightly raised. Caleb followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing. Tire marks were faintly visible beyond the trees, half covered by drifting snow. Whoever had come had parked out of sight. He straightened slowly. The farmhouse wasn't just forgotten. It was guarded. A memory flickered in his mind. Victor Hale's smooth voice at the auction. Some places are better left alone. Caleb returned inside and closed the door again. He moved quickly now, not in panic, but with clarity. He descended back into the bunker. This time he worked faster. He gathered several of the classified folders, slipping them into his backpack. He took photographs with his phone of the bunker interior, the serial numbers, the dog tags. He pried open another crate. Inside lay stacks of sealed envelopes. Bearer bonds. His pulse jumped. Old but intact. He didn't count them. Didn't need to. The value was obvious. But the money wasn't the most important thing. It was the paper trail. He flipped through another file. Names, dates, coordinates, references to containment measures. Several documents bore the signature of a private defense contractor long dissolved in the 1980s. One name repeated multiple times, Hale Defense Logistics. Caleb's jaw tightened. Victor Hale's family. Ghost shifted beside him, nudging Caleb's leg gently. Caleb paused. He had spent years believing the worst was behind him, that the corruption tied to his own failed mission had been an isolated event. But this bunker felt like something larger, older, systematic. He climbed out once more and sealed the hatch carefully, replacing the warped boards loosely above it. It wouldn't fool a determined search, but it would buy time. Night had fully fallen outside. Snow reflected moonlight faintly, turning the clearing silver. Caleb stood in the doorway and looked toward the dark tree line. He could leave now, drive back to the highway, disappear before morning. But if they were monitoring the property, they might follow. Ghost leaned against his leg. Caleb rested his hand on the dog's neck. "We're not ghosts anymore," he said quietly. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the field. Caleb stepped off the porch and walked to the Suburban. He opened the back hatch and retrieved his old field binoculars. From the edge of the clearing, he scanned the tree line carefully. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then a faint glint, metal reflecting moonlight, high in a pine tree. He adjusted focus. A small mounted camera, partially camouflaged, active. His stomach tightened. They weren't just reacting. They were watching in real time. Ghost let out a low growl. Caleb lowered the binoculars slowly. "They were never gone," he whispered. Behind him, the farmhouse creaked softly in the cold. Above him, unseen eyes recorded every move. This was no longer about shelter. This was about exposure. And whoever controlled that surveillance would not let Black Hollow Farm change hands quietly. The night deepened, and with it came a stillness that felt almost artificial. The wind had died completely. Even the trees stood motionless against the pale glow of the moon. Caleb moved with purpose now. Fear had shifted into something sharper, clarity. He returned to the farmhouse and barred the front door as best he could with a heavy kitchen table. He covered the broken window upstairs with an old curtain he found in a closet. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it might slow them down. Ghost followed him from room to room, quiet, alert, unwavering. "All right," Caleb murmured. "We do this smart." He descended into the bunker once more, this time bringing a portable lantern from the Suburban. The steady light filled the underground chamber with a dull yellow glow. Standing there, fully illuminated, the bunker looked less like a relic and more like an operation that had simply paused. The walls were reinforced with thick concrete. A secondary steel door stood at the far end of the room, partially concealed behind stacked crates. Ventilation pipes ran along the ceiling, still intact. Dust lay thick on the floor, but not evenly. Caleb crouched and ran a finger through it. Footprints. Old, but present. Ghost moved toward the far wall again, sniffing beneath the collapsed shelf. Caleb shifted a crate aside. Underneath, sealed in oilcloth, lay additional files. He unwrapped one carefully. Inside were detailed maps of the region. Markings circled Black Hollow Farm in red ink. Lines extended outward, connecting to nearby properties, some of which Caleb recognized as modern developments around Silver Ridge. One name appeared again and again on acquisition documents: Hale Defense Logistics. His breathing grew slow and controlled. Victor Hale hadn't just mocked the farm. He had a history tied to it. Caleb opened another crate. Inside were more bearer bonds, stacked neatly in waterproof wrapping. The paper edges were crisp despite the decades underground. Money. A lot of it. But it wasn't greed that tightened Caleb's chest. It was context. He flipped through another folder and found black and white photographs, rows of unmarked trucks parked beside the farmhouse in 1974. Men unloading metal cases, civilians standing nearby, faces blurred intentionally. He found incident reports referencing containment protocol failure and civilian exposure. His jaw clenched. This wasn't just surveillance or hidden wealth. Something had happened here. Something serious enough to bury. Ghost gave a soft whine. Caleb turned. The dog had uncovered something else beneath the debris. A second set of dog tags. Caleb lifted them gently. Sergeant Marcus Doyle, U.S. Army, 1976. Also listed as missing in action. His throat tightened. These men hadn't vanished overseas. They had vanished here, in Montana, inside this bunker. Caleb leaned back against the cold concrete wall and closed his eyes for a moment. The old guilt stirred, the familiar weight pressing against his ribs. He had carried his team's loss for years, believing the system had simply failed them. But this was something else. Systematic concealment. Ghost nudged him softly. Caleb opened his eyes and looked at the dog. "You smell it too, don't you?" Ghost's ears remained forward. A faint vibration passed through the concrete beneath Caleb's boots. He froze. Not footsteps this time. A low hum. Distant, but mechanical. He looked toward the ceiling. Above ground, somewhere in the clearing, an engine idled. Caleb extinguished the lantern instantly and climbed the ladder silently, stopping just beneath the hatch. Through the small gap in the boards, he saw headlights sweep across the kitchen walls. White beams sliding back and forth. A vehicle had entered the clearing. Ghost stood perfectly still behind him. The engine cut. Doors opened. Voices, low and deliberate, carried faintly through the wood. "Check the perimeter. Boss wants confirmation." Caleb's pulse steadied instead of racing. This was no longer suspicion. This was confirmation. He descended back into the bunker silently. "We're not ready," he whispered to Ghost. He gathered the most critical documents, land maps, corporate records, photographs, and packed them tightly into his backpack. He slipped the dog tags into his pocket. He left the bearer bonds untouched. Money could wait. Truth could not. He climbed up again and gently replaced the hatch. From the kitchen, he could see flashlight beams cutting through the living room. Boots entered the house. Caleb retreated quietly up the narrow staircase to the second floor, Ghost moving beside him like a shadow. They slipped into the far bedroom and crouched low beside the boarded window. Two men moved through the rooms below. Their movements were efficient, not reckless. They wore dark jackets, faces partially covered against the cold. "They opened it," one of them muttered. "Boss won't like that." "Doesn't matter. We reset and monitor. If someone bought this place, we flush them out." Caleb's jaw tightened. Flush them out. The men replaced the kitchen boards roughly, not carefully. They exited the house within minutes. The engine outside restarted. Headlights faded. Silence returned. Caleb remained still for a full 5 minutes before standing. He descended carefully and examined the hatch area. They had not entered the bunker. They had only checked. Testing. Watching. He stepped onto the porch and scanned the clearing again. The camera in the pine tree remained fixed, active. Ghost stood beside him, shoulders squared. Caleb looked toward the mountains rising beyond the property. This was no longer about finding shelter. It was about uncovering something buried deliberately, and someone powerful was desperate to keep it that way. Caleb rested his hand on Ghost's back. "They're not just protecting money," he said quietly. "They're protecting a secret." Snow began to fall lightly again, flakes drifting down in silence. The farmhouse stood in the clearing like a witness refusing to speak. But the bunker below had already begun to tell its story. Dawn came slow and gray over Black Hollow Farm. Caleb hadn't slept. He sat at the kitchen table, back to the wall, rifle resting across his knees, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the broken window. Snow fell in thin sheets, erasing tracks from the night before, as if the mountain itself were trying to hide evidence. Ghost lay at his feet, but did not close his eyes. Every few minutes his ears twitched toward distant sounds only he could hear. When the light was strong enough, Caleb stepped outside. The clearing looked innocent again. Smooth snow, still trees, no vehicles in sight, but the camera remained. He raised the binoculars and studied the pine tree. The small device was mounted high, partially camouflaged with netting. A faint red indicator blinked almost invisibly against the bark. Active. He lowered the binoculars slowly. "They're not amateurs," he murmured. Back inside, Caleb packed the documents he'd taken from the bunker into a waterproof pouch and tucked it beneath the spare tire compartment in the Suburban. If someone returned and searched the house, the evidence wouldn't be there. By mid-morning, he drove back toward Silver Ridge. The road felt longer this time. The town appeared peaceful when he arrived. Smoke curling from chimneys, pickup trucks parked outside the diner, a school bus rumbling past. Normal. Almost painfully normal. Caleb parked near the grocery store and went inside, keeping Ghost close at heel. A few people glanced at the dog but said nothing. He bought coffee and a small bag of jerky with the last of his change. When he returned to the Suburban, he froze. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. He knew he had locked it. He opened it carefully. The interior looked untouched at first glance. Then he saw it. The glove compartment hung slightly open. His spare flashlight was missing. Nothing else appeared disturbed. A message. We can reach you. Ghost's body stiffened, nose sweeping across the seat. He gave a low, warning growl and moved toward the rear hatch. Caleb followed him around the vehicle. Near the back bumper, carved faintly into a thin layer of road salt, were 3 words scratched by a gloved finger. Leave now. Caleb stared at it for several seconds. Anger rose, not explosive but steady and cold. He wiped the words away with his boot. Inside the truck, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photographs he had taken in the bunker. The signal was weak, but enough to search. He typed, Hale Defense Logistics, Montana, 1970s. Several archived news clippings appeared. One mentioned a private defense contractor operating in the region during the Cold War, specializing in communications research. Another referenced a congressional inquiry in 1981 into missing federal equipment and undocumented land acquisitions near Silver Ridge. The inquiry had ended abruptly. Caleb's jaw tightened. He drove toward the far end of town, where an old Victorian house stood converted into a local historical society office. A small brass plaque by the door read, Evelyn Boone, Regional Historian. He knocked. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a woman in her late 70s with sharp blue eyes and silver hair tied neatly behind her head. Yes? Ma'am, Caleb said respectfully, removing his hat. I was told you know a lot about Black Hollow Farm. Her expression shifted slightly. Who's asking? Caleb Mercer. She studied him, then glanced down at Ghost. And the dog? Ghost. A faint smile touched her lips. You'd better come in. The house smelled of books and cedar. Stacks of archival boxes lined the hallway. Framed photographs of Silver Ridge from decades past covered the walls. Evelyn led him into a sitting room and closed the door. You're the one who bought it, she said quietly. Yes, ma'am. She exhaled slowly and lowered herself into a chair. I wondered who'd be brave enough. Caleb sat opposite her. What happened there? He asked. Evelyn's eyes darkened slightly. In the early 70s, men came to town claiming they were conducting communications research for the government. They bought land quietly, hired locals for short-term jobs. Then people started disappearing. She paused. Hunters, a ranch hand, 2 young men who were working security. Caleb placed the dog tags on the table. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she picked them up. These names, she whispered. We held memorials for them. They were in a bunker under the farmhouse, Caleb said evenly. Silence filled the room. Victor Hale's father, Evelyn said finally, was a regional director for that contractor. After the project shut down, he acquired large portions of surrounding land for almost nothing. Shut down? That's what we were told. Caleb leaned back slightly. They're still watching it, he said. Evelyn's eyes flicked up. You're certain? Yes, ma'am, Paul. Before she could answer, Ghost's ears snapped upright. Outside, an engine roared suddenly. Too fast, too close. Caleb moved to the window instantly. A dark SUV sped past the house and turned sharply down the side street. Evelyn's face went pale. They've never been this bold, she whispered. Caleb stepped back from the window. They know I've been asking questions. Evelyn looked at him steadily now. Then you need help. From who? She reached for a notepad and wrote a name carefully. Naomi Barrett. Former military prosecutor, Evelyn said. She doesn't scare easily. Caleb folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. Outside, snow began falling again, heavier this time. He stood and extended his hand. Thank you. Evelyn clasped it firmly. Be careful, Mr. Mercer. Caleb nodded and stepped out into the cold. As he walked toward the Suburban, he felt it again, that weight of eyes. Across the street, parked between two trucks, sat the same black SUV he had seen near the farm the night before. Engine idling, watching. Ghost stepped closer to Caleb's side, muscles tight. Caleb met the darkened windshield with a steady stare. The vehicle did not move. Not yet. The game had changed, and whoever controlled Black Hollow Farm had decided he was no longer invisible. The black SUV idled across the street, exhaust curling into the falling snow. Its windows were tinted dark, unreadable. Caleb stood beside the Suburban, one hand resting lightly on Ghost's collar. He did not look away. After a long, steady moment, the SUV's engine revved softly. It pulled away without speeding, disappearing down the narrow street, as if nothing unusual had happened. Caleb waited another full minute before getting into the Suburban. "They're pushing," he muttered. Ghost remained alert, eyes on the rearview mirror. Caleb drove back toward Black Hollow Farm without stopping again. The snow thickened as he climbed into the mountains, visibility narrowing to a gray tunnel ahead of the headlights. By the time he reached the clearing, the storm had intensified. Wind tore across the open field, rattling the farmhouse boards. Snow struck sideways against the siding like thrown sand. He parked the Suburban closer to the porch this time, reducing open exposure. Before entering the house, he scanned the tree line carefully. The surveillance camera remained. He raised the rifle and fired a single shot. The lens shattered in a spray of sparks and glass. Silence followed. No return fire. No movement. Ghost gave a short, sharp bark. "Let them know we see them," Caleb said quietly. Inside, he moved quickly. He blocked the doors with heavier furniture. He carried extra boards upstairs and nailed them loosely over vulnerable window frames. He gathered tools from the barn, old wire, rope, rusted farm equipment, and began improvising defensive barriers. Not traps meant to harm, but obstacles meant to slow. If they came again, he wanted time. Night fell fast. The blizzard grew violent. Wind screamed through broken seams in the house. Snow forced itself through cracks in the siding. The power lines overhead snapped somewhere in the distance with a faint, distant pop, plunging the clearing into complete darkness. Only the lantern on the kitchen table cast a weak glow. Ghost paced restlessly, nails clicking against warped boards. Caleb stood near the front window, peering into the white chaos. Then he saw it. Headlights, 2 sets. They emerged slowly through the storm, beams cutting through snow like knives. Caleb's pulse steadied. "They're coming," he said softly. The vehicles stopped near the tree line, partially concealed. Doors opened. 4 silhouettes moved toward the farmhouse. Not hurried, confident. Caleb stepped back from the window and extinguished the lantern. Darkness swallowed the room. He moved to the staircase, signaling Ghost with a quiet hand motion. Upstairs. They retreated to the second-floor bedroom, positioning themselves behind the boarded window with a clear view of the porch below. Boots crunched outside. The front door rattled. Furniture shifted but held. A voice carried faintly through the wind. "Mercer, we just want to talk." Caleb said nothing. Another voice answered. "You don't understand what you're messing with." A heavy thud struck the door again. The wood splintered slightly. Caleb felt the old adrenaline rise. Controlled, precise. This wasn't panic. It was muscle memory. The back door creaked. A second group was circling. Ghost's body went rigid, teeth bared silently. A window downstairs shattered under force. Glass scattered across the floor. Two figures entered through the rear of the house. Caleb moved swiftly down the hallway and positioned himself above the stairwell. He didn't fire blindly. He waited. The intruders moved cautiously through the living room. Flashlights swept across walls. One stepped onto the first stair. Caleb kicked over the loose railing he had positioned earlier. It crashed down the staircase, forcing the man back off balance without serious harm, but enough to disrupt their advance. Ghost darted down 2 steps and barked sharply, deep and commanding. The intruders hesitated. Another voice from outside shouted, "Fall back!" A sudden crack echoed across the clearing. Not gunfire. A tree limb snapping under heavy snow. But it added chaos to the moment. Caleb moved quickly to the back of the house as the men retreated toward the broken window. Snow swirled violently inside. Ghost leapt forward just as one intruder turned to exit. There was a brief struggle in the doorway. A grunt, fabric tearing, and Ghost returned immediately when Caleb called him off. The men stumbled back toward the vehicles. One fell in the snow near the porch, dropping something metallic. Within seconds, the engines roared. The vehicles reversed quickly and disappeared into the white storm. Caleb stood in the shattered doorway, breathing steadily. Snow poured into the living room. Ghost limped slightly toward him. Caleb's chest tightened. The dog's shoulder bled where a blade had grazed him during the brief struggle. "Easy," Caleb whispered. He knelt immediately, pulling Ghost gently back inside. The wound was shallow but bleeding steadily. Caleb pressed a clean cloth against it, hands steady despite the storm raging around them. "You're okay," he murmured. "You're okay." Ghost's eyes remained locked on his. The house groaned under the wind. Caleb wrapped the wound carefully with gauze from his small first aid kit. The dog winced once but didn't pull away. Snow blew through the broken window, collecting in white drifts across the floor. Caleb closed the interior door and retreated to the kitchen. On the floor near the porch, he spotted the metallic object dropped by one of the intruders. He picked it up. A radio, military grade. On the side, a small logo was stamped. Hale Logistics Security Division. Caleb stared at it. The storm outside roared louder. This wasn't intimidation anymore. It was escalation. And as he looked down at Ghost, wounded but steady, something shifted inside him. This was no longer about surviving winter. This was war coming back to his doorstep. And this time, he would not walk away. The storm raged through the night, but inside the farmhouse, a different kind of quiet settled. Caleb dragged a heavy oak cabinet in front of the shattered window and nailed plywood over the worst of the opening. Snow still forced its way through cracks in the boards, but the wind no longer screamed directly into the room. He lit the lantern again and knelt beside Ghost near the old stone fireplace. The dog lay on a folded blanket, breathing steady but shallow. The bandage around his shoulder had already begun to stain through slightly. Caleb replaced it gently. "You've had worse," he murmured. Ghost's amber eyes held his without fear. Caleb pressed his forehead lightly against the dog's. For a moment, the fight drained out of him. The adrenaline faded, leaving only exhaustion. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Caleb had managed to get it going with scraps of dry wood from the barn. The flames cast long, flickering shadows against peeling wallpaper. He sat back against the wall, legs stretched out, rifle resting across his lap. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the world felt smaller, more fragile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the 2 sets of dog tags he had found in the bunker. The metal glinted faintly in the firelight. Lieutenant Daniel Rowe. Sergeant Marcus Doyle. Forgotten men. Buried beneath a farmhouse in Montana. Caleb swallowed hard. "I used to think," he said quietly, voice rough, that if I had made one different call, if I had moved 2 seconds sooner, my team would still be here. Ghost shifted slightly, placing his head across Caleb's boot. I carried that, Caleb continued. Every night, every mile, every empty morning. The fire popped softly. I thought I was done fighting. His eyes drifted toward the kitchen floor, where the hidden hatch lay concealed beneath loose boards. But this place, he murmured. This place didn't end. It just went underground. The guilt he had buried for years felt different now, less suffocating, more focused. Because this wasn't about a failed mission overseas. This was something ongoing, something deliberate. Ghost nudged his hand gently. Caleb scratched behind the dog's ear. You saved me once, he whispered. The memory came back clear and sharp. A frozen riverbank outside Helena. Dark water. Caleb standing at the edge staring into it. Ghost had lunged at him without warning, knocking him flat into the snow. Barking, refusing to let him stand. That had been the night Caleb chose to live. Now the dog lay wounded beside him because Caleb had chosen to stay. The weight of that truth pressed against his ribs. I won't let them take this from us, he said softly. The fire burned lower. The storm began to fade. Around midnight, the wind softened into a whisper. Snow continued falling, but gently now. Caleb stood and moved quietly to the window, lifting the plywood slightly to peer outside. The clearing lay untouched. No headlights. No movement. Only white silence. He returned to the kitchen and pulled the radio device dropped by the intruder from his coat pocket. Hale Logistics Security Division. He turned it over in his hand. There was no mistaking it now. Victor Hale wasn't reacting out of curiosity. He was protecting something his family had guarded for decades. Caleb walked to the table and unfolded the maps taken from the bunker. Under the lantern light, he traced the property boundaries with his finger. One document caught his eye. A notarized federal land patent dated 1973. It outlined mineral rights extending far beyond the visible acreage of Black Hollow Farm. The document included language granting exclusive control over subsurface resources and access corridors. His eyes narrowed. He cross-referenced it with another map showing modern resort expansion plans. Victor Hale's ski development overlapped that same boundary. If the land patent was valid, Hale's project was built on land that legally belonged to Black Hollow Farm. Caleb leaned back slowly. The fight wasn't just about secrecy. It was about land, power, control, and millions of dollars in mountain real estate. The fire burned down to glowing embers. Caleb wrapped another blanket around Ghost and finally allowed his eyes to close for a moment. Not sleep, just rest. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't trapped in the past. It was focused forward. Morning light crept through the boarded windows hours later. The storm had passed. The sky above the clearing was bright and clear, as if the violence of the night had never happened. Caleb stood stiffly and stepped outside. Snow reached nearly to his knees now, but something else caught his attention. Fresh tracks. Not vehicle tracks this time. Boot prints leading from the tree line to the edge of the clearing. They stopped short of the farmhouse. Someone had watched the attack from a distance, observed, recorded. Caleb's jaw tightened. This wasn't over. It was escalating. He turned back toward the house and looked at Ghost standing in the doorway, bandaged but steady. This ends one way, Caleb said quietly. We bring it into the light. He pulled his phone from his pocket, and unfolded the scrap of paper Evelyn had given him. Naomi Barrett, former military prosecutor. Caleb stared at the number for a long moment. Then he pressed dial. As the phone rang, he glanced toward the mountains rising beyond the clearing. The war he thought he had left behind had found him again. But this time, he wasn't alone, and he wasn't fighting in the dark. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. Naomi Barrett. Her tone was steady, direct. "Ma'am," Caleb said. "My name is Caleb Mercer. I was given your number by Evelyn Boone. I'm calling about Black Hollow Farm." There was a brief pause. "I was wondering when someone would," Naomi replied calmly. "Where are you?" "On the property." "Are you safe?" "For the moment." Another short silence, then. "Bring whatever documents you have. Meet me at my office in Bozeman. Don't drive directly. Change routes. And don't come if you're being followed." The line clicked off. Caleb lowered the phone slowly. Ghost stood beside him, watching the tree line. Caleb packed carefully. The land patent, the corporate records, the photographs, the dog tags. He left the bunker sealed again and reinforced the boards one more time. Before leaving, he paused on the porch and looked across the clearing. Black Hollow Farm no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like evidence. The drive to Bozeman took longer than expected. Caleb changed roads twice, stopping briefly at a gas station outside a different town to check his mirrors. No black SUV, no tail. Naomi Barrett's office occupied the second floor of a brick building overlooking Main Street. The sign on the door read, "Barrett and Associates, Veteran and Property Law." Inside, the office smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. Framed military commendations hung on one wall beside side law degrees. Naomi stood when Caleb entered. She was in her early 40s, hair pulled back neatly, posture straight. Her eyes held the sharp focus of someone accustomed to courtroom battles. "You look like you've had a long week," she said. Caleb gave a faint nod. She glanced at Ghost. "And you must be the real security detail." Ghost stood quietly at Caleb's side. Caleb set the documents on her desk. Naomi opened the land patent first. Her expression changed immediately. "Where did you get this?" "Beneath the farmhouse." She read silently for several moments, turning pages slowly. "This is a federal land patent issued in 1973, she said, "signed and recorded. It grants mineral and subsurface rights extending well beyond the surface boundary." She pulled up a zoning map on her computer and overlaid property lines. Her jaw tightened. "Victor Hale's resort expansion sits directly over this corridor." Caleb crossed his arms. "So he doesn't own it?" "Not legally," she said quietly. She flipped to another folder and studied the corporate records. Hale Defense Logistics. That company was investigated in the early 80s for irregular acquisitions. Nothing stuck. She looked up at Caleb. "Do you understand what this means?" "Tell me." "If this land patent is valid, and it appears to be, you own the subsurface rights beneath his expansion. Ski lifts, access roads, utility corridors." Caleb remained still. Naomi leaned back slowly. "And the bearer bonds?" "Still in the bunker." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You've already survived one attempt to scare you off." "They came with more than words." Naomi nodded. "That tracks." She folded her hands together. "Victor Hale will not want this public. He'll try one more time to make you disappear quietly." As if summoned by the prediction, Caleb's phone vibrated. Unknown number. He answered. "Mr. Mercer," Victor Hale's voice said smoothly. "You've had a busy few days." Caleb stepped toward the window, eyes steady. "What do you want?" A conversation, Hale replied. Some misunderstandings can be resolved without escalation. You sent men to my property. They were checking on an asset long neglected. Nothing more. Caleb said nothing. Hale continued. You've stumbled into something bigger than you realize. I'm prepared to offer you a generous buyout. Cash. Immediate. Enough to walk away comfortably. How much? Caleb asked calmly. $5 million. Naomi's eyebrows lifted slightly as she listened from across the desk. In exchange, Caleb asked. The deed. The documents. Silence. Caleb glanced at Ghost. The dog met his gaze. Memories flickered. Snow inside the Suburban. The night at the river. The storm at the farmhouse. Caleb's voice remained steady. No. A quiet sigh came through the line. You're making a mistake. No, Caleb replied. You are. He ended the call. Naomi let out a slow breath. That was bold. He won't stop, Caleb said. No, she agreed. But now we control timing. She reached for her phone. I'm contacting a federal investigative journalist I trust, and I'm filing an injunction immediately to freeze any expansion on Hale's development pending review of the land patent. Caleb nodded once. Naomi looked at him carefully. This won't be clean. There will be pressure, smear campaigns, maybe more intimidation. I've handled worse. She studied him a moment longer, then offered her hand. Then let's finish it. Outside, sunlight broke through scattered clouds over Bozeman. The mountains stood clear and sharp against the sky. For the first time since stepping into Black Hollow Farm, the balance of power shifted. Victor Hale had money, influence, security, but Caleb had something Hale did not expect. Proof. And proof, once exposed, could not be buried again. The investigation moved faster than Victor Hale expected. Within days, Naomi Barrett filed the federal injunction blocking further development on Hale's luxury resort expansion. A respected investigative journalist published the first report linking Hale Defense Logistics to undocumented land seizures and Cold War operations beneath Black Hollow Farm. Photographs of the bunker surfaced online. So did copies of the 1973 land patent. National news outlets picked up the story. Questions followed. Why had missing service members' dog tags been found in a private underground facility? Why had federal land rights been concealed for decades? Why did a private security division attempt to intimidate a decorated veteran? Under mounting scrutiny, federal investigators reopened archived defense contractor files. Subpoenas were issued. Bank accounts were examined. Former employees began to speak. The black SUVs stopped appearing. The surveillance ended. Victor Hale's public statement claimed ignorance of his father's activities, but leaked emails contradicted him. Financial records tied his corporation directly to property acquisitions overlapping the protected land patent. 6 weeks later, Hale stepped down as CEO pending formal charges. Construction halted indefinitely. The empire he had built on secrecy and intimidation began to fracture. Caleb watched much of it unfold from the porch of Black Hollow Farm. Snow slowly melted across the clearing as early spring crept into the mountains. Pine branches shed their heavy white burden. Sunlight lingered longer each evening. Ghost lay beside him, shoulder healed, though he moved more slowly now. Reporters had requested interviews. Caleb declined most of them. Naomi handled the legal statements. Evelyn Boone testified before a state committee, her steady voice filling hearing rooms with forgotten history. Federal authorities secured the bunker. The bearer bonds discovered inside were authenticated and legally transferred to Caleb as the rightful property owner. Combined with the mineral rights outlined in the land patent, the valuation stunned even Naomi. It was enough to buy comfort for a lifetime. But comfort was never what Caleb had searched for. One morning, as the frost lifted from the fields, Caleb stood at the edge of the clearing where the old barn once stood, burned and broken. Construction crews, local veterans hired through a community outreach program, worked carefully to rebuild the structure. New beams rose where charred timber once collapsed. Caleb had made his decision quietly. Black Hollow Farm would not become a private retreat. It would become something else. The sign went up near the entrance that summer. The Mercer Recovery Ranch, for homeless veterans and retired military K-9S. Word spread quickly. Within months, the once abandoned farmhouse held life again. Veterans arrived from across Montana and neighboring states, men and women who had slept in vehicles, who had struggled with memories that refused to fade, who had felt invisible in towns that moved on without them. Caleb did not promise miracles. He offered work, structure, quiet mornings repairing fences, afternoons tending to rescued dogs once trained for service and later discarded, evenings spent around a fire pit beneath open Montana sky. Ghost moved slowly among them, older now, gray dusting his muzzle. He rested beside new arrivals as if recognizing the same haunted look in their eyes. Sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, Caleb would wake from old memories. The desert heat, the echo of distant gunfire, the weight of loss. But he no longer woke alone inside a rusted Suburban. He stepped onto the porch and watched the sun rise over Black Hollow Farm. He watched other veterans stepping into the cold morning air, coffee mugs in hand, nodding quietly to one another. He watched retired K-9s run cautiously through open fields, rediscovering space and trust. The land that once hid secrets now offered healing. One afternoon, Naomi visited the ranch. She stood beside Caleb at the fence line as volunteers repaired the final section of pasture. "You could have disappeared," she said. "Taken the money. Lived anywhere." Caleb looked across the clearing. "I tried disappearing once," he replied softly. "It nearly killed me." Naomi nodded. "Victor Hale is facing multiple charges," she added. "Asset seizures, fraud, obstruction." Caleb didn't smile. Good. He watched Ghost lying beneath the shade of the rebuilt barn, surrounded by two younger veterans brushing his coat. "He carried me through the worst," Caleb said quietly. "This place is for all of us who came back, but never really came home." That evening, as the sky turned gold and purple over the mountains, Caleb sat on the porch beside Ghost. The air was warm, the wind gentle. He reached down and rested his hand on the dog's back. "For a while," he whispered, "I thought surviving was enough." Ghost shifted closer. "But it's not." Caleb looked out at the ranch, at fences rebuilt, cabins rising in the distance, smoke curling from chimneys. "It's about building something that outlasts the fight." The sun dipped behind the ridge. The porch fell into shadow. In the fading light, Black Hollow Farm no longer looked like a haunted place. It looked like purpose. And for the first time in years, Caleb Mercer did not feel like a man running from the past. He felt like a man standing exactly where he was meant to be. Do you want me to revise any chapter for stronger emotional impact? He felt like a man standing exactly where he was meant to be. If you believe a person has the right to stand their ground and protect what's theirs, type yes in the comments. And if you've ever had to fight quietly for your dignity, drop a 1 so we know you're out there. Subscribe and stay with us for more stories about justice, resilience, and ordinary Americans refusing to back down.